Hashtag the brutal reality of driving over your own infantry in the chaos. Tank warfare, 37 hours without sleep, and the stick felt like it belonged to someone else's hands. The Le Mans Russ lurched sideways, caught a shell crater's lip, and Private First Class Donovan Teague yanked the left lever back hard enough to feel the metal bite into his palm through his worn crew gloves. Mud and something thicker sprayed across the vision slit. Behind him, Commander Whelan was screaming coordinates into the Vox unit, his voice cracking on every third word like a teenager's, though he was 40 if he was a day. The engine roared, the treads chewed, and somewhere beneath them, in the wet dark of the killing field they were crossing, something went thump. Not a shell crater thump, not debris thump, softer, wetter, a resistance that gave way. Teague's stomach dropped through the floor of the crew compartment, through the transmission housing, through 40 tons of blessed Imperial steel, and kept falling. His hands stayed on the levers. His feet stayed on the pedals. The Le Mans Russ named pennants of Calthor kept moving at 14 kilometers per hour through the night-black chaos of what had been, 6 hours ago, the 445th Helventine Infantry Regiment's forward staging area. Contact right! Contact right! That was Brennan on the sponson, his voice thin with the particular terror that came from watching LA's fire walk across your position, and knowing the armor between you and it was thinner than a man's finger. Teague didn't look right. Couldn't. The vision slit showed him mud and bodies and the burning wreckage of what might have been a Chimera transport. And his job was to drive, just drive, keep driving until Whelan told him to stop or until something punched through the hull and made the question academic. The treads pulled them forward, the engine screamed, and in the space between his ears and his spine, where the seat padding had worn through months ago, he felt the tank's vibrations tell him a story he didn't want to hear. Thump, thump, thump. Too soft for rock, too frequent for coincidence. Where is the damned infantry? Whelan's voice, high and wrong. Teague, where is the infantry? I don't know, sir. The words came out flat, dead, a corpse of a response. I don't know. The battlefield had gone sideways sometime in the night. The enemy armor column that was supposed to be 30 kilometers north had materialized from the fog like something out of a nightmare, their vehicles burning promethium so corrupted it left trails of toxic green in the air. The 445th had been sleeping in their dugouts. The 445th had been brewing recaf and writing letters home. The 445th had been alive. Emperor saved them, actually alive. And then the shells started falling and Whelan had given the order to move and Teague had started driving and he hadn't stopped. Thump. His hands were shaking. He could feel it in the way the levers trembled, a frequency that didn't match the engine's rhythm. Through the vision slit, a shape rose up from the mud ahead, human, armored in the brown and gray of Helventine combat dress, arms raised, mouth open in a scream Teague couldn't hear over the engine noise. Las fire flickered past the figure's head. They weren't trying to get away from the enemy, they were trying to flag down the tank. They were trying to wave it off, to redirect it, to make it understand something. Teague's foot hesitated over the brake pedal. Keep moving! Whelan, his hand clamping down on Teague's shoulder from behind, fingers digging into the muscle with desperate strength. Keep moving or we're dead. The figure in the mud dove sideways. Teague couldn't see if they made it clear. The vision slit showed only more mud, more dark, more shapes that might have been men and might have been debris and might have been the broken promises of an Imperium that asked everything and gave nothing back. Thump, thump, thump. The vibration pattern was unmistakable now. Not wreckage, not terrain, the specific, horrible resistance of bodies going under the treads. This was what they never told you in training. Not really. Oh, they mentioned it in the clinical way they mentioned everything. Collateral losses, acceptable parameters, operational necessities. They showed you diagrams of tread clearance and talked about soft obstacles versus hard obstacles, and they never once mentioned that the soft obstacles screamed. Or maybe they did scream. Maybe he just couldn't hear them over the engine. Marcus Brennan opened fire with the heavy bolter, the weapon's thunder adding another layer to the noise that filled the compartment. Spent casings pinged off the interior walls. The smell of propellant mixed with the recycled air's staleness, with the crew's unwashed sweat, with something else that might have been burning flesh from outside. The tank shuddered with each burst. Teague kept driving. His father had driven cargo haulers in a hive manufactorum. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, moving raw materials from one processing point to another through tunnels so narrow the hauler's sides scraped the walls. He used to come home with stone dust in the creases of his face and tell young Donovan that driving was a skill, a trade, something to be proud of. Put a man in the seat, he would say, and you find out what he's made of. Thump. Teague was finding out what he was made of. He didn't like the answer. Hard left, hard left. Whelan's coordinates were garbage, Teague knew. The commander was navigating by guess and terror, trying to push them toward what he thought was the regiment's rally point, but the rally point had been overrun an hour ago. Teague had heard it happen over the Vox, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's voice cutting out mid-sentence, the wet crunch that followed, the static that swallowed everything. The 445th didn't have a rally point anymore. The 445th might not exist anymore. There was just Penance of Calthor and its 4-man crew, grinding through the dark toward an objective that had ceased to be real. Commander. Teague's voice cracked. He tried again. Commander, I think we're in the infantry staging area. I know where we are, Teague. Drive. Sir, the bumps. I said drive. Whelan's hand found the back of Teague's head and shoved, grinding his face toward the vision slit, forcing him to look at the mud and the fire, and the shapes that kept rising up and falling down and going thump under the treads. The commander's fingers were trembling too. Teague could feel it through his skull. They were both scared. They were both driving over their own men. They were both going to keep doing it because the alternative was stopping, and stopping meant dying, and dying meant nothing would be left to carry the horror of this night forward into testimony. Someone had to survive to confess. Through the vision slit, the burning chimera's light revealed a stretch of ground that made Teague's gorge rise. Bodies, dozens of them, maybe more, scattered across the mud in the particular disarray of troops caught in the open during an artillery barrage. Some were clearly dead, torn apart by shrapnel or crushed by falling debris. Others were moving, crawling, trying to drag themselves out of the tank's path. Teague saw a man with half his body buried under a fallen sandbag revetment, arm extended toward the approaching tank, mouth working around words drowned by the engine noise. The treads were going to reach him in 4 seconds. 3, 2, thump. The vibration traveled up through the hull, through Teague's seat, through his spine, and lodged somewhere behind his eyes like a splinter. He tasted copper. His vision blurred, then cleared. The arm was gone from the vision slit's frame. The tank kept moving. Contact rear, Brennan again, spinning the sponson weapon to cover their 6. Enemy armor, 200 meters and closing. Teague, faster. Whelan's voice had gone shrill. Desperate, the voice of a man watching his death approach. Full power to the engine now. Teague's foot pressed down. The engine's roar climbed. The treads churned faster through the mud and the bodies and the screaming dark. Somewhere behind them, an enemy shell whistled past, close enough that the pressure wave made the hull ring like a struck bell. This was survival. This was duty. This was what the Imperium required of its servants, the willingness to crush everything beneath the treads, including your own people, if it meant the war machine kept moving forward. Thump, 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 thump. Teague stopped counting. He wasn't sure when he'd started. The Vox crackled with interference, static and screaming and fragments of orders from officers who might already be dead, but cutting through it all, clear as a knife through fog, a single voice. Penance of Calthor, this is Sergeant Darrell Vickers, Bravo Company. We're pinned at coordinate 773. We need immediate extraction. The enemy is... Static swallowed the rest. Whelan leaned forward, his breath hot against Teague's ear. Plot intercept to 773. Sir, that's directly through the... I know what it's through, Teague. Plot the intercept. Teague's hands moved on the levers without consulting his brain, the muscle memory of a dozen training runs taking over, while his conscious mind screamed at him to stop, to think, to refuse. 773 was half a kilometer northwest. The direct path would take them through what looked like the remains of a field hospital, tents still burning, stretchers scattered across the mud like dropped toys. "There are wounded there, sir." Teague heard his own voice, as if from a great distance. "Are wounded. The enemy is 200 meters behind us and closing. If we divert around the hospital, they catch us in the open. If they catch us in the open, we die. If we die, Vickers and everyone else at 773 dies too." Whelan's voice had gone flat. Clinical, the voice of a man performing calculations that didn't include human variables. "The math is simple, Teague. The math was simple. The math was always simple. The math was why the Imperium had endured for 10,000 years, because men like Whelan could look at a field of screaming wounded and see only obstacles, only numbers, only acceptable losses subtracted from operational necessities." Teague drove into the hospital. The first stretcher went under the right tread with a crunch that was different from the thumps before, the sound of wood and metal and bone all mixing together. The second followed a heartbeat later. Through the vision slit, Teague saw a Medicae officer in blood-spattered white stumbling backward, hands raised, mouth shaping words that might have been prayers or curses, or simply the animal refusal of the mind to accept what was happening. The tank didn't slow. The tread didn't discriminate between the healthy and the wounded, the dying and the dead. Everything in the path went down the same way, into the mud, under the steel, into the dark. Thump, 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 thump. Enemy shell incoming. Brennan's warning came too late. The impact struck their rear quarter, not a direct hit but close enough to send the Le Mans Russ sliding sideways, treads screaming as they fought for purchase in the blood-slicked mud. Teague wrestled the controls, overcorrected, felt the hull start to tip, caught it at the last moment with a countersteer that would have made his instructors proud if they hadn't all died at Karras Reach 3 years ago. The tank stabilized. The engine coughed, caught, roared back to full power. Behind them, something was burning. Probably a tent, probably equipment, probably... Teague didn't let himself finish the thought. 773, 100 meters. Whelan's voice had steadied, the commander finding his footing now that the worst was behind them. Except the worst wasn't behind them. The worst was under them, ground into the mud, reduced to the component parts that even the Departamento Munitorum's most thorough statisticians wouldn't bother counting. The Vox crackled again, Sergeant Vickers, his voice tighter now, desperate. "Penance, we can hear your engine. We're in the crater, the big one, 50 meters north of the burning transport. Don't shoot, we're coming to you. Don't shoot." As if shooting was the danger, as if the heavy bolter or the battle cannon posed the real threat, and not 40 tons of blessed Imperial steel moving at speed through a battlefield, where the lines between friend and enemy had dissolved into chaos and blood and screaming. Teague saw them emerge from the crater, a dozen figures in Helventine brown and grey, running toward the tank with their arms waved high, their weapons slung, their faces lit by the fires behind them. Relief, terror, hope. He could read all of it in the way they moved, the way they stumbled over their own feet in their desperation to reach safety. "Slow to quarter speed," Whelan ordered. "Let them board." Quarter speed was still fast enough, still dangerous enough. The tank's momentum didn't care about orders or intentions or the desperate need for survivors. Teague pulled back on the throttle, felt the engine's roar drop to a growl, felt the treads slow their chewing. Not enough. One of the running figures, a woman, Teague thought, though it was hard to tell through the mud and the dark, tripped over something in the path, a body or a piece of debris, and went down hard. She rolled, tried to rise, and her eyes found the tank's prow coming toward her. Teague saw her face in the firelight, young, terrified. Not much older than his sister back home on Calthor Prime. His foot slammed down on the brake. The Lemon Russ shuddered, treads locking, hull grinding forward through the mud on pure momentum. The woman threw herself sideways, rolling desperately, and Teague watched the right tread pass within arm's reach of her head, close enough that the mud spray probably blinded her, close enough that if she'd been a second slower. "What the hell are you doing?" Whelan's scream filled the compartment, his hands grabbing Teague's shoulders, shaking him like a disobedient child. "Keep moving." "The enemy The shell hit them square in the sponson. Brennan didn't have time to scream. One moment he was there, manning the heavy bolter, his profile visible in Teague's peripheral vision, and the next moment there was fire and metal and a wet sound that would live in Teague's ears for whatever remained of his life. The hull breached. Shrapnel sang through the crew compartment, and Teague felt something hot slice across his left arm, felt blood begin to flow, felt pain arrive like an afterthought. Whelan was screaming orders that didn't make sense. The loader, Corporal Jennings, quiet Jennings who kept pictures of his daughters taped inside his helmet, was trying to get the fire suppression system online, his hands moving with the desperate efficiency of a man who knew he was seconds from burning alive. The tank was still moving. Teague's foot had come off the brake during the impact, and the Leman Russ was rolling forward again, slower now, damaged, but still moving, still grinding forward over the mud and the bodies and the screaming. Thump. Teague didn't know if that was debris or a person or a piece of Brennan. He didn't look. He grabbed the levers and steered for the crater where Vickers and his survivors were still waiting, because duty was duty, and the mission was the mission, and there was nothing left to do but drive. The survivors from Bravo Company swarmed the hull. Teague could feel them climbing, their boots ringing against the armor, their hands grabbing at every protrusion. The rear hatch clanged open, Jennings pulling people inside with his burned hands while the fire suppression foam hissed around him. Voices, too many voices, all talking at once, asking questions that had no good answers. What happened? To the regiment? Where's the colonel? Is anyone else coming? Teague didn't answer. His eyes stayed on the vision slit, his hands stayed on the levers, his foot stayed on the throttle. Behind them the enemy shells were still falling, but they were falling farther away now, the distance growing as Penance of Calthor limped towards something that might have been safety or might have been just another killing field waiting to happen. The woman he'd almost crushed appeared at his side, her face still pale with shock, her hands shaking as she braced herself against the compartment wall. "You stopped," she said. "You actually stopped." Teague didn't look at her, couldn't. Yeah, no one stops. The tanks never stop. I stopped. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was different, smaller, the voice of someone who had seen too much and understood that seeing it had changed nothing. "How many? How many what? How many did you—" She couldn't finish, didn't need to. Thump. The tank passed over another shape in the mud, another soft obstacle, another number that wouldn't appear in any after-action report. "I don't know," Teague said. "I stopped counting. It was a lie. He hadn't stopped counting. He couldn't stop counting. Every thump had registered somewhere in the back of his mind, adding to a tally that grew with every meter of ground covered, every second of driving, every moment of choosing survival over mercy. The woman's hand found his shoulder, squeezed once and let go. She moved away to help Jennings with the other survivors, leaving Teague alone with the levers and the vision slit and the endless mud stretching out ahead. The battle noise was fading. Either they'd broken through the engagement zone or the fighting had moved elsewhere, leaving Penance of Calthor grinding through a graveyard of its own regiment's making. Through the vision slit, Teague could see the shapes of bodies everywhere, scattered across the churned earth, like seeds that would never grow into anything but nightmares. Some of them were still moving. "Commander!" Teague's voice came out hoarse, scraped raw by smoke and screaming. "There are survivors in the field, our people. Do we stop?" Whelan had slumped against the commander's seat, his face grey in the emergency lighting, his hands pressed against a wound in his side that Teague hadn't noticed until now. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark and thick in the red-tinged darkness. "Commander, keep driving." Whelan's voice was a whisper, a ghost of the barking authority that had pushed them through the chaos. "Keep driving until we reach friendly lines. But the survivors are already dead." Whelan coughed and something wet came up with the sound. "They just don't know it yet. The enemy will sweep the field within the hour. Anyone we leave behind. It's a mercy, Teague. Faster than what they'll do to prisoners. Mercy." The words sat wrong in Teague's mouth, wrong in his ears, wrong in every part of him that still remembered what mercy was supposed to mean. Mercy was stopping. Mercy was opening the hatch and pulling people aboard and taking the risk, because the alternative was grinding them into the mud, like every other soft obstacle in the path. Mercy was what you gave when you had choices, and the Imperium had stripped away every choice except one: drive or die. Teague drove. The hours bled together after that, measured in fuel consumption and ammunition counts and the steady decline of Whelan's vital signs. Jennings did what he could with the medical kit, but the kit had been designed for burns and shrapnel, not the kind of wound that left a man's intestines visible through torn flesh. The survivors from Bravo Company huddled in the rear of the compartment, their faces blank with shock, their voices silent. Sergeant Vickers sat nearest to Teague, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. He was older than Teague had expected, late 40s maybe. 50s, with the weathered face of a man who had survived more battlefields than he could remember. His eyes never left the vision slit, watching the same mud and bodies and endless grey that Teague watched. "The 445th is gone," Vickers said eventually. Not a question. A statement of fact, delivered with the flat acceptance of someone who had seen regiments die before. "I don't know." Teague's hands tightened on the levers. "Maybe some units got clear." "No." Vickers shook his head slowly, the motion barely visible in the dim light. "I was in the command tent when it started. Morrison tried to organize a fighting retreat, but the enemy armor was already in the staging area. They came through the fog like ghosts. No warning, no time, just death. We got warning." The words came out before Teague could stop them, bitter and sharp. "We were moving before the first shells hit." Vickers turned to look at him, something unreadable in his eyes. "You were lucky." "Lucky?" Teague laughed, and the sound was ugly wrong, the laughter of a man standing at the edge of a cliff and trying to convince himself the fall would be painless. "We drove through the regiment to get out, through our own people. I felt them go under the treads, I know." Vickers' voice didn't change, didn't soften, didn't harden. Just that same flat acceptance, that same weathered understanding. "I watched you do it." The admission hung in the air between them, a confession and an accusation, and something else that might have been absolution, though Teague wasn't ready to accept that yet. "You didn't try to stop us," Teague said. "Stop a tank?" Vickers shook his head again. "Might as well try to stop an avalanche with your bare hands. The math was simple. You kept moving, you survived. You stopped, you died. Everyone you drove over." He paused, and for a moment something flickered across his weathered face, something that might have been grief or guilt, or simply the exhaustion of a man who had been doing this kind of math for too long. They were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. Whelan's words, echoed by a man who had watched his people go under the treads. The math was simple. The math was always simple. The math was why Teague's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Dawn came slowly, grey light seeping through the smoke and cloud cover like water through cracks in a dam. The battlefield fell away behind them, replaced by fields that had once been farmland, churned now into mud by the passage of military convoys, scarred with shell craters and the wreckage of vehicles that hadn't made it this far. Bodies here too, though fewer, soldiers caught in retreat, cut down by strafing runs or artillery barrages or the simple mathematics of war. Through the vision slit, Teague spotted the distant shapes of Imperial fortifications, prefab bunkers and earthwork trenches, the clustered silhouettes of vehicles behind defensive berms. Friendly lines, safety, or the closest thing to it that existed in a war zone. "Contact ahead," he reported, more from habit than necessity. "Imperial positions 2 kilometers. Whelan didn't respond. He hadn't responded to anything in over an hour. Jennings was still sitting beside him, still pressing bandages against the wound that wouldn't stop bleeding, but his movements had become mechanical, hopeless, the motions of a man performing last rites rather than first aid. Vickers leaned forward, his voice carrying the authority of a senior NCO who had outlived his officers. "Slow approach. Make sure they see our markings. The last thing we need is to get killed by friendly fire after surviving that nightmare." Teague eased back on the throttle, feeling the tank's speed drop, feeling the treads slow their endless chewing. The fortifications grew larger in the vision slit, taking on definition and detail, gun emplacements tracking their approach, troops moving behind the earthworks. a Chimera transport rumbling out from behind a bunker to intercept them. Normal, safe, real, and completely disconnected from the night behind them, from the thump 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 of bodies going under the treads, from the face of the Medicae officer in the burning hospital, from the woman who had almost died because Teague had stopped when stopping was forbidden. The Chimera pulled alongside, and a voice crackled over the vox. "Penance of Calthor, this is Forward Operating Base Cassian. Identify your unit and status." Vickers reached past Teague to grab the vox horn, his voice steady, professional, utterly devoid of the horror he must have been carrying. "Fob Cassian, Penance of Calthor is 445th Regiment, attached armor. We have 1 dead, 1 critically wounded, and 11 survivors from Bravo Company. Requesting immediate medical assistance and debriefing. Static." Then, 445th Regiment? We received reports the 445th was overrun. You're the first survivors we've seen, the first survivors, not the only survivors, not the last survivors. Just the first, which meant others might still be out there, still trapped in the killing field, still waiting for rescue that would never come because the tanks had driven through instead of stopping. "Understood," Vickers said. "We'll provide full after-action report upon arrival." The vox clicked off. The Chimera escort fell in beside them, guiding Penance of Calthor toward the fortification's vehicle bay. Through the vision slit, Teague watched the gate open, watched the earthworks pass on either side, watched the grey morning light give way to the artificial illumination of a military installation that didn't know yet what had happened in the night. "Someone should tell them," the woman from Bravo Company said quietly. She had moved back to Teague's side at some point, close enough that he could hear her breathing over the engine's growl. "About the others, the ones we left behind, they'll know." Teague's hands found the brake, slowing the tank to a crawl as they entered the vehicle. "Bay. The enemy will broadcast it. They always do. Show off their kills, prove the Imperium can't protect its own. In a day or two, the whole sector will know that the 445th was slaughtered to the last man. But we survived. Did we?" The question came out hollow, emptied of everything except exhaustion and the weight of a tally that would never stop growing. Define survival. Define living. Because I'm not sure either of those words means what it used to. The tank ground to a halt. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. Damage from the sponson hit finally catching up with them, the machine spirit giving out now that safety had been reached. Around them, the vehicle bay erupted into motion, Medicae teams rushing toward the rear hatch, tech priests moving to assess the damage, officers striding forward with data slates already raised to record testimony. Teague's hands stayed on the levers. His eyes stayed on the vision slit, even though there was nothing to see now except the bay's metal walls. Whelan died somewhere in the chaos of the next few minutes. Teague heard it happen, the flat tone of the Medicae's report, the rustle of a body being removed on a stretcher. The prayers muttered by someone who still believed prayer meant something. He didn't look. Couldn't. His hands stayed on the levers. His eyes stayed on nothing. They pulled him out eventually, Vickers primarily, with help from 2 of the Medicae officers who recognized the signs of combat shock and handled him with the careful efficiency of people who had seen it before. The light outside the tank was too bright. The air smelled wrong, chemical and clean after hours of smoke and blood and burning. The ground didn't move beneath his feet, didn't vibrate with the engine's rhythm, didn't transmit the thump-thump-thump of bodies going under. He stumbled and caught himself on the tank's hull, his hand finding the tread assembly, the metal links still caked with mud and something darker. Mud and blood and what used to be people. Private Teague, a voice, clipped and official, an officer probably, a commissar maybe, someone with a data slate and questions that would turn the night's horror into bullet points and statistics. "You're the driver of this vehicle?" "Yes." "You navigated through the engagement zone during the retreat?" "Yes." "Your commander," the late Commander Whelan, gave orders to proceed directly through the infantry staging area rather than circumnavigating?" "Yes." The word felt like a stone in his mouth, heavy and cold. He said the math was simple. The officer paused, stylus hovering over the data slate. The math? Stop and we die. Drive and we live. Everything in the path. Teague's voice broke, then steadied, the words coming out flat and dead. Everything in the path was acceptable loss. The officer made a note. And you followed these orders? I followed orders. Without question? Teague finally looked at the officer, a lieutenant, young, probably fresh from some officer academy where they taught tactics on hololithic displays and never mentioned what it felt like to drive a 40-ton tank over screaming men. The lieutenant's uniform was clean, his boots were polished, his face was smooth and soft and utterly unmarked by the kind of math that turned people into obstacles. Do you know what a tread feels like when it passes over a body? Teague heard himself ask. Not debris, not wreckage, a body, a person. Do you know what that vibration does to your spine, your hands, your brain? Do you know what it sounds like even through the engine noise? The lieutenant's stylus had stopped moving. I questioned every order, Teague continued, his voice rising, cracking, spilling over like a dam breaking. Every single one. I questioned and I argued and I begged, and I drove anyway because the alternative was dying, and dying meant no one would survive to tell you what happened, and telling you what happened is the only thing that makes any of it mean anything at all. He was crying now. When had that started? The tears felt strange on his face, hot and wet and completely disconnected from the cold emptiness inside his chest. Around him the vehicle bay had gone quiet. Every eye turned toward the crying driver and the uncomfortable lieutenant and the tank that sat behind them, like a monument to everything the Imperium required of its servants. Private Teague, Vickers' voice calm and steady cutting through the noise in Teague's head. The sergeant's hand found his shoulder, squeezed once, and guided him gently away from the officer. That's enough testimony for now. The man needs medical attention and rest before any formal debriefing. I haven't finished recording his... Lieutenant. Vickers' voice didn't change, didn't harden, but something in it made the young officer step back. This man drove through hell to get us here. He did what had to be done. If you want to question his actions, question them tomorrow, when he's had time to remember how to be human again. Right now, he needs to stop being a machine. The lieutenant made another note, nodded once, and moved away to question the other survivors. Vickers stayed at Teague's side, his hand still on the younger man's shoulder, his weathered face betraying nothing of whatever he was feeling. How do you do it? Teague asked, his voice hoarse from the crying. How do you keep going after something like this? Vickers was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than Teague had heard it before, touched with something that might have been sadness or might have been simple exhaustion. I don't keep going, not really. The person I was before my first night like this, he's been dead for a long time. What keeps going is just what's left, the parts that don't need to feel to function. That sounds like giving up. It sounds like surviving. Vickers shrugged, a small motion, almost invisible. Same thing in the end. A Medicae officer appeared at Teague's elbow, gentle hands guiding him toward the medical station, away from the tank, away from the treads, away from everything except the 2 bright lights and the 2 clean air and the promise of sedatives that would make him stop feeling, at least for a little while. He went. There wasn't anything else to do. The debriefing happened 3 days later, in a prefab room that smelled like recaf and desperation. They'd patched Teague's arm, sedated him for the worst of the first night, and given him a cot in the survivor barracks, where the remnants of a dozen shattered units lay staring at ceilings and waiting for orders that might never come. He'd slept, or something like it, but the dreams had been full of thumping and screaming and the vibration of treads over soft obstacles. Now he sat across a table from a panel of officers, 3 of them, plus a scribe, plus a commissar who sat slightly apart and said nothing, her eyes never leaving Teague's face. The room was small and grey, and utterly without distinguishing features, the kind of space designed to be forgotten as soon as you left it. Private Teague, the senior officer, a major according to his insignia, had a voice like gravel and eyes like something dead and floating. We've reviewed the testimony from the other survivors of Penance of Calthor. They corroborate your account of the retreat. Yes, sir. They also confirm that you hesitated multiple times during the drive through the engagement zone. That your commander was forced to physically compel you to maintain course at least once. The woman from Bravo Company, she must have mentioned it during her own debriefing, the moment Teague had braked to avoid crushing her. Yes, sir. The Major made a note. Hesitation in combat is a serious matter, Private. The Departamento Munitorum has clear guidelines regarding armor crew who fail to execute orders in a timely manner. Teague felt something cold settle into his stomach. He'd known this was coming, on some level. The Imperium didn't reward doubt or mercy or the kind of weakness that made a man break for a single life in a field of thousands. The Imperium rewarded math, simple, clean, inhuman math. However, the Major set down his stylus and folded his hands on the table. We've also reviewed the sensor logs from Penance of Calthor. The number of friendly casualties attributable to your vehicle's passage through the engagement zone is estimated at 147. 147. A number, just a number. Not faces, not screams, not the specific pattern of vibration that a human body made going under the treads. A number on a data slate, ready to be filed and forgotten. 147 lives, the Major continued, traded for the survival of 12. That's your math, Private Teague. Would you say it was worth it? Teague stared at the man across the table, at the dead eyes and gravel voice and the complete absence of anything resembling human feeling. This was what command looked like at the Imperium's higher levels. This was what happened to people who did the math long enough, well enough, until they forgot there had ever been anything on the other side of the equation. I don't know, sir. That's not an acceptable answer. It's the only answer I have. The Major made another note. The Commissar shifted slightly in her chair, and Teague felt her attention sharpen, pressing against him like a physical weight. This was the moment. This was where they decided whether his hesitations had been acceptable or treasonous, whether his survival had been service or cowardice. The math, the Major said slowly, is always simple, Private. 11 survivors from your vehicle plus yourself. 12 lives, preserved to fight again. 147 deaths, exchanged for continued operational capacity. That's a ratio the Departamento Munitorum finds acceptable. Acceptable. 147 people ground under the treads of their own army's tank, and the word they used was acceptable. However, the Major's voice hardened. Your hesitations endangered that ratio. Your commander was forced to override your failures multiple times. Had he not done so, your vehicle would have been destroyed by enemy fire, and the 12 survivors you carried would have joined the casualties. I understand, sir. Do you? The Major leaned forward, his dead eyes finding Teague's and holding them with unsettling intensity. Do you understand that mercy is a luxury the Imperium cannot afford? That every time you hesitate, every time you break for a single life, you risk thousands? Do you understand that the people under your treads were already dead, and that your only duty was to ensure their deaths meant something? Teague thought about the woman from Bravo Company, the one he'd almost crushed, the one who had touched his shoulder afterward and said you stopped. He thought about the Medicae officer in the burning hospital, arms raised, mouth moving around words he couldn't hear. He thought about every face that had risen up from the mud and fallen back down and gone thump under the treads. Yes, sir. The lie came out smooth, easy, the voice of someone who had learned what answers were acceptable. I understand. The Major nodded, apparently satisfied. Then you'll have no objection to your reassignment. Reassignment. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. The 445th Regiment is officially defunct, the Major continued. Survivors are being absorbed into other units as replacements. Given your experience, and the word experience carried weight, carried meaning, carried the silent acknowledgement of what that experience had cost. You're being assigned to the 116th Armored Division. They're preparing for deployment to the Khalistan Front. The Khalistan Front. Teague had heard stories about Khalistan, whispered between soldiers in mess halls and barracks. A grinding war of attrition, armor against armor, with infantry caught in between. The kind of front where tanks drove over their own men regularly because the math was simple and the alternative was losing ground to the enemy. "You'll report to your new unit tomorrow morning," the major said. Dismissed, Teague stood. His legs felt strange, disconnected, like they belonged to someone else. The commissar's eyes followed him to the door, and just before he reached it, she spoke for the first time. "Private Teague." He turned. She was older than he'd realized, her face lined with scars that spoke of battles survived and decisions made. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, and that gentleness was somehow more terrifying than all the major's cold authority. "The Emperor requires many things of his servants," she said. "Faith, duty, sacrifice. But the hardest thing he requires is this, the willingness to become the thing you hate, if that is what victory demands, and if becoming that thing destroys you." The commissar smiled, and there was nothing behind it but empty spaces where humanity used to live. "Then you die having served. Is there any greater honor?" Teague left without answering. There wasn't an answer that would satisfy both of them, and he wasn't sure there was an answer that would satisfy even himself. He found Vickers outside the debriefing building, leaning against a ferrocrete wall and smoking something that smelled like processed tobacco and regret. The sergeant didn't look up as Teague approached, just shifted slightly to make room against the wall. "Reassignment?" Vickers asked. 116th Armored, Khalistan Front." Vickers made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something darker. "They're sending you back to the treads. Apparently my experience is valuable." "It is." Vickers took a long drag from his smoke, held it, exhaled slowly. "They'll pair you with a new crew, a new commander, a new tank, and sooner or later, you'll find yourself driving through another staging area, another hospital, another field of your own people. And you'll do the math just like you did before. And if I hesitate again, then you die." Vickers shrugged, the same small motion Teague remembered from the vehicle bay. "Or you don't hesitate, and you live, and you spend the rest of your life trying to figure out whether living was worth what it cost." The woman from Bravo Company appeared around the corner of the building, her uniform clean now, her face less pale than it had been in the tank's compartment. She stopped when she saw them, hesitated, then walked over. "I heard about your reassignment," she said. "Khalistan. Word travels fast. Not much else to do around here except gossip and wait for orders." She stood next to Teague, not quite touching, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. "I wanted to say thank you for stopping. I almost got everyone killed stopping." "Almost isn't the same as actually." She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, pressed it into his palm. Teague looked down, a spent shell casing, brass tarnished with heat and handling, stamped with the Imperial Aquila on its base. "My brother's. He was in the hospital when you drove through. The medics got him out before." She didn't finish, didn't need to. "If you hadn't hesitated when you did, if you hadn't slowed down even a little, they wouldn't have had time." Teague stared at the shell casing, feeling its weight in his palm, feeling everything it represented pressing against the 147 lives that had gone under his treads. "The math," he heard himself say, "doesn't account for things like this, no." The woman's hand found his shoulder, squeezed once, let go. "That's why the math is wrong." She walked away, leaving Teague with the shell casing and the sergeant, and the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him like 40 tons of blessed Imperial steel. Vickers finished. His smoke ground it out against the ferrocrete and straightened. "Tomorrow, you report to your new unit. You climb back into a tank, put your hands on the levers, and start driving again. That's the only choice the Imperium gives you. And if I refuse, then the commissar does her job, and someone else climbs into the tank instead." Vickers met his eyes, and for a moment, Teague saw something behind the weathered acceptance, a flicker of the person Vickers had been before his first night like this, still alive somewhere deep inside, still fighting to matter. "The math doesn't stop because one man breaks, Teague. The tanks keep rolling, the treads keep chewing. All you can control is what kind of person is behind the levers, the kind who hesitates, the kind who remembers why hesitating matters." Vickers put a hand on his shoulder, the same gesture, the same weight, the same silent acknowledgement of everything that words couldn't carry. "The Imperium wants machines. It needs machines. But every now and then, a man gets behind the levers who still remembers what it was to be human. And maybe, just maybe, that matters. Maybe the hesitation saves one life that shouldn't have been lost. Maybe it's not enough, maybe it's never enough, but it's something. Teague closed his fingers around the shell casing, feeling its edges bite into his palm. Something, he repeated. Better than nothing, Vickers said. In a universe like this, that's all any of us can hope for. The sun was setting over the forward operating base, painting the sky in shades of red and orange that looked too much like fire. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled, the Khalistan front, already hungry for reinforcements, already waiting for the next wave of tanks and crews and soft obstacles that would go under the treads in the name of victory. Tomorrow, Teague would climb back into a lemon Russ. Tomorrow, he would put his hands on the levers and feel the engine's vibration through his bones. Tomorrow, he would start counting again. But tonight, he stood in the dying light and held a shell casing and remembered the face of a woman who had almost died and chose to believe, if only for a moment, that the hesitation had been worth something. The tally would grow, the math would never stop being simple, the treads would keep chewing through mud and bodies and everything the Imperium fed them, but the man behind the levers would remember, and as long as he remembered, as long as he hesitated, as long as some part of him still flinched at the thump-thump-thump of lives going under the steel, he would be more than just a machine. He would be a witness. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there was only war, sometimes being a witness was the only mercy left.